Welcome to TYT Interviews. I'm Anna Kasparian, and we are about to finally do an interview that I've been looking forward to for quite some time now. Joining me is Matt Taibbi, an incredible journalist and, of course, an author. He's written several books, but his recent book was a little therapeutic for someone like me, Insane Clown President, which I highly recommend you guys all check out and read. It is so addictive that you'll probably finish it in one sitting. Matt, thank you so much for joining us.
No, thanks for having me on.
All right, I have a lot to say about your book, a lot of questions to ask you as well. But I'm going to start off by making a comment. You don't hold back. There were a lot of shots fired in this book, and it was very enjoyable to read.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. It's actually, I think a lot of the characters in this book were very challenging to describe. Mm-hmm. So that was part of the thing that made this the process fun, although it turned out to have a very dark ending, of course.
Yeah.
But the challenge, especially with the early part of the campaign with the clown car and all that was difficult for a writer to kind of try to match the comedy of what was actually happening.
Exactly. And if you look at the cover and, of course, the title of this book, you'll think that it's just about Donald Trump. But actually, what I feel your book does is it really sets the stage for why someone like Donald Trump was able to get elected as the president of this country. And so, it's a critique of our media, it's a critique of, political players, a critique of the establishment, a lot of the things that have gone wrong for decades that led up to Donald Trump getting elected. But before we get to the details of your book and some of the questions I have regarding people that you mentioned, I do want to just briefly talk about the fact that this time around you did not travel with reporters as you typically do to cover the election. And, off camera, we had a quick conversation about how, it takes a considerable amount of resources just to do what journalists were able to do in the past. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I did a little bit of the pool reporting late in the game with Trump, but this is something that most people don't know about, that it's an extremely expensive venture to travel with the campaigns, especially once they get to the late stages when they're chartering airplanes, when the Secret Service is involved. It can be many thousands of dollars a day. So, it's hard for anybody except for the very richest news organizations to really have people on for weeks and weeks at a time. And I used to do that. I mean, and we used to pay that bill back in 2004, 2008, and we probably would have done it this time, except the costs have gotten out of control on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you're not getting any access to the campaigns anymore. At least in the old days, the candidate would come to the back of the plane, you talk to the aides. Now, and with Trump, you were traveling in a separate plane. You were basically talking to people who, stewards and stewardesses. So there was really no upside, and it's exclusionary. It keeps out the alternative media.
Yeah, that's actually the best point. The fact that if you're independent media and you don't have, the necessary corporate backers to find the resources to travel along and do this type of reporting, well, you have no chance. But
right.
What do you think the value is of being one of these pool reporters? I mean, that was a part of your book that you really honed in on, and I really did enjoy, just like this notion that these reporters just end up being one massive circle jerk for the candidates as opposed to, individuals who are supposed to hold these candidates accountable.
Right, yeah. So the main problem with it is that it becomes like a social thing. You're trapped in the same environment with the same people for days and days and weeks on end. And, whether consciously or unconsciously, you start to adopt the values of those people. And if you do this over and over again, campaign after campaign, then it becomes like the journalists essentially become enforcers of an orthodoxy. They're really there to, it's like high school. They're there to pick on people who don't fit in and to enforce the values of campaigning. And people who don't fit their mold of what quote-unquote presidential is, they get battered in the press. And it can be anybody. It can be on the left or the right. It can be people like Ron Paul or people like Dennis Kucinich or Bernie Sanders, who are just described as fringe candidates and not to be taken seriously. And this is all just part of this sort of high school mindset that sets in when the candidates and the press are stuck together for too long in the same environment, and you have to keep out the alternative media. So it's a specific group of people who are in the press, and they're all stuck together with the political elite.
So for several elections, general elections, we have seen, this deviation from policy-based campaigning to more character-based campaigning. And so I think the media has really driven that narrative. And part of the problem is what you just mentioned now, this high school atmosphere, this bullying, this, hey, you need to fit a conventional mold. And the second you deviate from that, well, then we're going to criticize you. And you talk a little bit in your book about the death seal. So tell our audience a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I was joking with a reporter in Iowa about this, and basically he was talking about how, we have a script when candidates kind of fall off the edge and they slip up and they do something dumb or unfortunate, like Howard Dean with the Scream or Gary Hart with the monkey business photo. We all know what it is, and it's just we pile on with negative stories. There is a brief period where the candidate doesn't know what to do. Then there's an abashed public apology. Then the candidate tries to soldier on bravely for a few weeks. And then there's a quiet exit a few weeks later. This is a script. We repeat it over and over again. And a friend of mine jokingly calls it the seal of death. Once a candidate ventures into that territory, this script happens, and it basically never fails. But it failed this year with Donald Trump. They tried to do it multiple times. They tried to put the seal of death on him, and he escaped over and over and over again. And actually, each time they tried to apply it, like after the McCain thing, after the Megyn Kelly thing, he actually got stronger in the polls, which was a signal that what was happening is that voters were responding negatively to the press and their attempts to try to control the situation.
It was just this rejection and this complete distrust of what the press had to say about Donald Trump. And why is that? Why did this kind of reaction occur by our electorate in regard to someone like Donald Trump? Because, look, the death seal was ridiculous when it came to people like Kucinich or Howard Dean and his, random yell. Like, who cares? Why did that end up killing his career? But then you have someone like Donald Trump who got caught on tape talking about grabbing women by the genitals, and that was totally okay. That actually ended up helping him. Why is that?
Well, this is a classic boy who cried wolf scenario. I think what happened was we alienated the general public through our behavior, campaign after campaign, and a lot of it is really class based. I think there's basically a sense out there among voters that the people who cover presidential elections they're effete, college-educated people who live in New York, LA, and Washington for the most part, and they're socially the same people who are running the campaigns. They hang out at the same places. They live in the same Georgetown neighborhoods or the Upper West Side or whatever, and they're not the same people who are voting. For the most part, they're a very different group. And so Donald Trump, I think, very explicitly kind of pointed this out to his crowds. He would say, look at these people, they never come so far for an event, and his message was basically, I'm one of you and I'm against them. And he kind of somewhat absurdly made us the representative of elitist culture. He's the billionaire, but he was the common man. But it was effective. I think actually we solved his accessibility problem for ordinary people by being more hated than he was, and that was brilliant in a way.
Yeah, that is interesting, and also it's fascinating because it's even hard to say this, but among the two candidates, there was only one candidate who talked about policy, even though it wasn't specific, even though it wasn't detailed. And then you had another candidate who just focused on character assassination, and I think that also helped Donald Trump.
Right. Well, Trump did talk about policy. He, especially in the primary period, he did get into some issues that were real, and he touched on some truths that were powerful. Mm-hmm. Especially when he was talking about people like Jeb Bush, and he would say, how can you trust this guy? He's got the CEO of Johnson & Johnson as his finance chairman. You think he's going to get you cheaper pharmaceuticals? Of course not. And he's absolutely right about that, and So what he would do is he would sprinkle in, like all good con men, he sprinkles in things that are true and elements that are believable, and that helps sell the long con in the end. And apart from that, he was just better at connecting with people in person than Hillary was, and that was a huge factor also.
Absolutely. And it was one of many factors. I think that, after the election, so many people tried to figure out what went wrong. And you have people on the Democratic side trying to find a scapegoat. It was Russia. It was fake news. It was, the media. There were so many scapegoats, but no one wanted to take responsibility for one of the biggest issues, which is this disconnect among establishment politicians and the average voter. There were so many people who had voted for President Obama, and they refused to vote for Hillary Clinton this time around.
Right.
And they ended up voting for Trump.
Right. Yeah. No. The one thing that everybody heard who did this work in the last couple of years out in the campaign trail was, you would interview somebody about any candidate, and the first thing out of their mouths was, "This person's a politician. I hate him or her," or "This guy isn't a politician. That's why I like him." Mm-hmm. And that had to do with a lot of things. I think on the Democratic side, and on the Republican side, there was this slow drift away from the idea that either party had to be really and truly connected to ordinary people. The Democrats, I think, kind of took voters for granted for a very long time, and their formula for winning elections was, we'll be socially liberal, and that will get us a certain number of people to the polls. But on the hard stuff, on economics, we're going to be "quote unquote" business friendly, and we're going to take the money, from Wall Street and all these other places. And the problem with that is that it ended up making them just closer and more intimate with their lobbyists and the K Street friends and the donors. And they never really did the work of staying in touch with what the voters actually were thinking and feeling. And look, that helped Trump. Trump came directly to the people. He didn't go through the Church of Conventional Wisdom. He didn't go through the media. He acted like somebody who was really interested in what ordinary people thought, even if it was totally absurd and conspiratorial. He connected with them on a level that the Democrats didn't try to.
Now, there was one Democrat who I would argue did connect with the average American, who did hear their concerns, not only heard their concerns, but is constantly concerned about their concerns and wants to do something about it, and that was Bernie Sanders. So we essentially had two anti-establishment politicians, right, or candidates, I should say. One pretended to be anti-establishment, the other genuinely was anti-establishment, Bernie Sanders. And why was it that his message didn't have the same widespread appeal that someone like, Donald Trump was able to garner up?
Well, I think it did have the same. I mean, they got almost the same number of votes during primary season. I mean, it was a 1.5 million, 2 million more votes for Trump ultimately. But the problem, Sanders had a couple of handicaps. Number one, he started off as the extreme underdog, and he only had to go against one candidate who was very heavily funded and had the entire machinery of the Democratic Party behind her. But the other thing was the coverage disparity. And this was the place where, if you wanted to point to a crime that the press had committed, this was where we really were guilty. Sanders got 23 times less network airtime than Trump did. Even though they were basically identical plot lines. They were both leading outsider rebellions against their own party and both being extremely successful and both turning out these enormous crowds. And they were both doing it for the same reasons, because of this widespread anti-establishment sentiment that was out there. But Sanders he didn't appeal to the same financial dynamic that Trump did. Trump was good business for the media, and Sanders was not. And he also was, even though Trump is insane and he flirts with these almost Nazistic themes, Sanders' politics were actually more taboo than Trump's were, and that kept him off the air.
Yeah, in your book you have a chapter dedicated to Bernie Sanders, and you kind of talk about Sanders' demeanor and how he comes off as like this grumpy dude who doesn't comb his hair and whatever. And you kind of describe why it is that he's so grumpy. And I thought that was a really powerful part of your book. Can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit for the audience?
Yeah, I mean, if I recall, I think what I was talking about was just his frustration level with the entire system. I mean, I've spent a lot of time with Bernie Sanders over the years. I did a story with him 11 years ago where he somewhat amazingly just invited me sight unseen to tag along for weeks and weeks on end with him when he was still in the House. And he did that because he wanted to show his constituents all the obstacles that he had to deal with on a daily basis in terms of getting legislation or amendments passed. And he wanted to prove that this labyrinthine system that was full of all these unseen obstacles made it extremely difficult for ordinary people's interests to be represented. And I think the frustration that Sanders feels in not getting the help from within the party to push through what he feels are urgently necessary measures, but then more than that, the media, its total inability to tackle serious issues, that just gets him incredibly frustrated. And I think it affects his ability to have a sense of humor about the whole thing, which is what everybody sort of wants him to do. Journalists love it when politicians kind of take their mask off in private and start to smile and joke and be sarcastic about the process. Well, Bernie's not like that in
Not
private.
at all. Not
He's
at all.
the same person on or off camera because he's just so frustrated. It's not a game for him, and I think that's what it is.
Yeah, the first time we had him in studio for an interview, this is before the primaries were over, it was kind of jarring how he doesn't really pretend to be like this, like super friendly, like, hey, what's up? Like, when's the interview gonna start? Like, he's very real. And so, yeah, he did come in very grumpy. And I was like, oh man, he must be really skeptical of us. Right. And then once he started the interview and he got really fired up and passionate, we're like, okay, there's Bernie Sanders. That's the guy that we see on the campaign trail. And we were very supportive of him during the primaries because of that reason. But it was kind of nice to experience that realness off camera as well. By the way, I just want to read a real quick part of the book that I was referring to earlier. So you're talking about why news networks wouldn't feature him or wouldn't cover his campaign. The Times remarks about his grumpy demeanor, but Bernie is grumpy because he's talking about vets who need surgeries, guest workers who've had their wages ripped off, kids without access to dentists, or some other godforsaken problem that most of us normal people can care about for maybe a few minutes on a good day, but Bernie worries about more or less all the time.
Right. This I had the amazing experience of being called to his office in the Senate, and I arrived there, and there were a couple of other journalists who he knew, and he basically kind of called us in just to say, hey, you guys got to cover this X, Y, and Z more. It was sort of like a lecture, like a scolding, almost in a parental way, and it was kind of cool. I think he recognizes that the media is an extremely powerful force in the country, and he believes that they should be allies in the quest to get ordinary people represented in issues like that. Whether it's something like the Lie Heat program, which gets more free heating oil to people who can't afford it in winter. Like, that stuff bothers him a lot, and it bothers him that people in the media don't pay attention to it. Well, there's a reason we don't pay attention to it, because most of us are upscale people who live, in the Upper East Side or in Chelsea or someplace like that. We don't have these problems, and he reminds us. I think that the world isn't in the same bubble that we're reporting in. The world is more important and bigger and has bigger problems.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about establishment miscalculations, because I think that happened quite a bit during the election and then right as we were leading up to it. So the DNC made a gigantic error by pushing for a very flawed candidate who just didn't connect with voters. And so, of course, there was the email leak where we find out that, the DNC absolutely did have a favorite and they did manipulate the primaries. And that pissed off a lot of voters, particularly young voters who were supportive of Bernie Sanders. Do you think that these individuals learned anything from this and will maybe correct some of these behaviors moving forward? Or do you think that they're just going to keep finding scapegoats and pushing candidates that don't make sense for the party?
Yeah, this is one of the things I said over the summer in the middle of the campaign is that I saw this coming, that they were not going to learn their lesson from what happened with Bernie. It was very soon after Bernie left the race. There was this sort of chattering from the pundit class that, well, now we don't have to take the left seriously because they're out of the picture, and that was close, but now we can get to the real business of doing what we do. And they go on, they assume that we're going to win, they get beat, and then immediately there's this flurry of excuses, as you said before. It's Russia, it's James Comey, it's the media, et cetera, and there was nobody who stood up and said, my God, how could we have such a bad message that we lost a popularity contest to Donald Trump? I think what's happening now, which is even more dangerous, is they're looking at this overwhelming negative reaction to Trump around the country, and they're seeing in it a political opportunity, which basically means that this is a way we don't have to change. Trump is so unpopular now that we can just double down on what we did over the summer, which is focus on his negatives and stress our own competence, and we won't have to reform ourselves. And I think that will put off this struggle for the soul of the Democratic Party that I think needs to be resolved before they can do anything significant.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they have to, reflect on their errors and really accept the fact that they are in their own little establishment bubble and do not connect with average voters. There were so many. The New York Times had this incredible piece where they profiled all these female Trump supporters. And on election night, I was particularly angry at women who voted for Trump because I just couldn't understand it. I'm like, how would you vote for someone who talks about grabbing pussies or, has said so many disgusting, deplorable things about women? And then I read these profiles of these women, and it turns out that half of them said that they wanted to vote for Bernie Sanders. They're just so sick of the political system. They're so sick of feeling like they're not represented. And even though Trump seems like a questionable character, he's at least pretending that he cares about these issues and that he wants to bring jobs back, that he wants to, go back to a time when people felt economically stable. And it just makes me so mad to think that Democrats haven't learned anything from that.
Yeah, and I had basically the identical experience when I was out on the campaign trail over and over again. I ran into people who would say things like, well, he's a socialist, but I kind of, I like him. I respect him. I think Bernie, if he had been the nominee, probably would have won. And that's not necessarily because I prefer his politics one way or the other. The gambler in me just basically would have placed a bet on Bernie ahead of Hillary just because of that one observation, that he seemed to resonate a little bit more with the conservatives than Hillary did. And look, here's what it comes down to. The problem is really simple. The Democrats can't bring themselves to not take the money, and the big step isn't necessarily anything about policy or, especially on the social side. They can't imagine a world where they can compete against the Republicans without the money that they get from Wall Street and all these other places. And until they take that step, they're never going to have the confidence of ordinary people, for the same reason that Jeb Bush didn't have the confidence of people against Trump, because they're always going to suspect that at crunch time, they're going to pick their donors instead of their voters. And look, it's true. That's a true contradiction that they have to resolve.
That's absolutely right. In fact, just to give you guys an example, while people were going to airports protesting Donald Trump's travel ban, the top contenders for the DNC, to head the DNC at least, were fundraising. So they were nowhere to be found. They're raising money because they're worried about funding their campaigns. And so that's a real problem. And that type of legalized bribery and corruption in the country has impacted both parties negatively, impacted our entire political system negatively. But it's really hard for American voters to be heard and represented when their voices aren't as strong as the voices of corporations and CEOs who, again, fund these politicians.
And there's sort of a reverberating effect also, because what happens when you depend on the money is the money leads you inexorably towards a certain kind of campaigning strategy. When you have lots of money, you tend to depend a lot on ad buys and legacy media and publicity to try to carry your day and bring your message to people. Whereas the more effective way of campaigning is through appearances. So if you're always fundraising on the one hand, that means you have less time to do in-person appearances. And then when you do have the money, what you're doing with it is you're spending it on commercials, and that's just not as intimate. There's no substitute for meeting people in person. And then it has a third effect, which is that when you're not out there, when you're not talking to people enough, you're not getting the intelligence of what people are actually feeling.
Right.
So all of these things impacted the Democrats last year.
Right. I mean, you saw Donald Trump doing rally after rally, giving his off-the-cuff speeches. Hillary Clinton wasn't doing the same, and she was not as warm and friendly to the press, did not want to do press conferences, and I think that ultimately hurt her as well. Finally, I want to touch on just how much everyone was caught off guard by Donald Trump's win. So I'm included in that. I did not expect him to win. I thought maybe there's a possibility that he can win, especially because, early polling had indicated that Bernie Sanders would fare way better than Hillary Clinton if, it came down to the general election against Donald Trump. But then the night before the election, I slept well. I thought it was going to be fine. And part of the reason why is because I bought into the polling and the conversations about Nate Silver. And Nate Silver is the god of everything, and he can predict anything, so we should believe him. And so let me just say, when I picked up your book and started reading it, I was like, this is good. And then bam, in the intro, you mentioned Nate Silver. And it's so, so good. I can't not read this to the audience. So here's what you said. Nobody thought it was odd when a baseball statistics guru, Nate Silver, became a godlike figure in the campaign bubble and America's foremost expert on what's going on in the heartland. I have nothing personal against Nate Silver. I was a big fan back in his baseball prospectus days, but elevating a bespectacled sabermetrics geek to the role of Nostradamus of middle American attitudes speaks volumes about where the country's political elite was at mentally heading into this campaign season. That was so therapeutic for me because we would get into arguments on the show where our panelists would be like, oh, but what did Nate Silver say? Let's talk about Nate Silver. I'm like, I don't give a fuck about Nate Silver, okay? So it felt so good to read that because the media ate it up. Anything he had to say, his polls, oh, was his methodology right? Of course there's going to be human error, right? And why do we care so much about his, polling outcomes as opposed to what we're seeing at these rallies and what Americans are concerned about?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And look, I fell for it too. I was at the RNC and I ran into a Democratic Party operative who sat me down and he said, look, the numbers say that these 4 highly unlikely demographic events have to happen for Donald Trump to win, and the likelihood of that, he's like pulling out a calculator and he's saying, it's somewhere in the, the tenths of a percent or something like that. And look, the problem with that is that it's entirely data driven. And again, I like Nate Silver. I like reading Nate Silver, but the problem with using polls as your method of taking the temperature of people is that you don't get the gradations of feeling. So, if somebody says yes or no, there's a huge difference between mere disapproval and rage, right? And you have to be able to talk to people in person to take the temperature, their emotional temperature. Are they furious? Are they ready to do anything at all to create change? Or are they just going to drag themselves to the polls and pull a lever? Well, those are huge distinctions because they reverberates in a town, right? Like if a person's angry, they're going to talk to everybody.
Yep.
And you're right. We should have trusted our own eyes because out there you could see these massive rallies and it was an unbelievable phenomenon. And I thought to myself, well, he looks like he's doing great, but the numbers just don't show it. And I fell for it along with everybody else. I think that's a lesson for all of us that we got to check ourselves with
Absolutely. And then what was it like when you did go to those rallies and people would recognize you as a more liberal writer for Rolling Stone? Did you ever get any, backlash?
Yeah, well, as soon as I took out the Rolling Stone business card, that was usually it. I think I had a success rate of about 20% in getting people to even talk to me. So it wasn't great. I think there were a lot of people in Trump's crowds who, look, I'll say this for them: a lot of them are willing to engage because they want to try to make a point, and they would say things to me that were kind of interesting at times. Like I had a guy once say to me, you asshole liberal media types from New York and LA are always trying to tell us how to live, and you can't change an oil filter. And and I thought that's interesting. I mean, it is a problem of there's a reason why they distrust media figures. It's because there is a sort of superior attitude that we carry, and we have to learn how to not have that. So I think that's important.
Yep. Finally, what is your prediction now that Donald Trump has been elected? He's been in office, 2 weeks? Not even 2 weeks at this point, but still, he's done quite a bit of damage. Do you see the tide turning on Trump? Do you see good things ahead? Is there a silver lining to all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I have a piece coming out next week where I basically say that it's like a bad hallucinogenic experience. It feels like it's been years, but it's only been days, really. So yeah, I don't see anything good coming. I think we have to see the bottom before this gets any better. And the bottom, I think, is going to be some kind of epic confrontation, whether it's an impeachment or something worse than that. And because he's a narcissistic personality, he's not going to be dissuaded from the track that he's taken. So it's going to get worse before it gets better.
All right. Hard to believe that we haven't hit rock bottom already, but I agree with you. I think there are some scary times ahead. Matt Taibbi, thank you so much for joining us. Check out his book, Insane Clown President, Dispatches from the 2016 Circus. It's a really good book, you guys, and I think that, if you want to know exactly what went wrong and what we need to do moving forward, this is a good guide for all that. So Matt Taibbi, thank you so much.